Carbohydrates aren't the enemy, but if you're over 40 and you're trying to lose weight, or you're trying to improve your energy, or you're trying to work on some sort of health goal, they may not be your friend either. The internet loves to make the whole carbohydrate discussion incredibly binary. Either they're good or they're bad. I want to break that down a little bit for you today. I'm Mandy. I'm a registered clinical nutritionist, and I work with thousands of clients over the age of 40 to help them get their energy, their weight, and their body back on their side. And we have really great results with this, and we have a really intentional way in which we approach carbohydrates. They're not good, they're not bad, they just need to be understood a little bit better. So I want to break it down for you today in the three key kind of lenses through which we look at carbohydrates in order to determine how to apply them to you as an individual to meet your needs and not kind of sabotage or impact your progress. So the three key ways that we look at this is carbohydrate form is the first part. This is often missed out of most carbohydrate discussions, and it's a really, really crucial part to how those carbohydrates then behave in your body. The next part is carbohydrate timing. When do we bring those carbohydrates in to be the most effective and really, really support your health and wellness goals? And then the next part is carbohydrate dosing, and this is determined by your personal need, maybe your blood sugar markers, maybe your activity levels throughout the day. So carbohydrate form, carbohydrate timing, carbohydrate dosing is what we're going to look at here. So let's talk about carbohydrate form first. Carbohydrates are essentially an energy form. They break down into sugars once we digest them, and they can come in the form of pure sugar. Most people know that, having a whole lot of this in your diet is not going to be super useful. They can come in the form of more refined carbohydrates. This is carbohydrates that have been processed to some degree. They're usually made from, say, a ground grain, i.e. wheat or tapioca or some sort of starch that has been dried and ground down and then made into another product. These are your refined carbohydrates, and then there is your whole food carbohydrates. These are your things like your root vegetables, your whole grain rice, your quinoa, these sorts of things where they pretty much are in the form in which they grew in. These three carbohydrates have a hugely different impact on your body when you consume them. When you consume sugar, your body absorbs it very quickly into your bloodstream. You get a very sharp spike in blood glucose levels, and then the body has to do something with that. Bit of context here is that you can't have just free glucose hanging around in your bloodstream for any amount of time. The body deals with it really quickly, either moving it into cells to be used as energy or moving it to the liver to be converted into a fat which can be stored. We can't just store glucose as such, very small amounts in glycogen, but as a general rule, it gets burned for fuel or it gets converted into a fat for storage. And if you're constantly spiking your blood sugar levels with quick access sugars, this is a real problem. If we go to the refined carbohydrates, very similar process. When you eat a refined carbohydrate food, you get this quick response of blood glucose elevation, and then you've got to do something with that sugar. You've either got to burn it, and most people don't, especially if they're over 40, have some weight to lose and are not metabolically flexible, convert it into fat where it can be burned or stored. Whole food carbohydrates are a little different. They still do break down into sugars, so if you eat an apple, you absolutely still get sugar from it, but it is a longer, slower process because the body, the digestive system has to work on that whole cell, which is in the plant, and break it apart. There's fiber there, there's an enzymatic process that has to go through. It takes longer to access the energy because we actually have to work on it. And this is what's really cool about the whole food carbohydrates, is that when you eat them, you get this kind of nice satiated response from them. It's quite calming for the nervous system, which we'll talk about when it comes to the timing, but it is not giving you this sharp rise in blood sugar levels in the same way as the refined or the pure sugar does. So when we're talking about carbohydrates, we're really wanting to understand the form in which you're introducing them into your meal structure. And we really promote the use of things like potato, sweet potato, your root vegetables like carrot, beetroot, these sorts of things. Maybe some brown rice or some basmati rice or some quinoa. These are your whole food carbohydrate forms that just digest a lot lower and slower and don't go spiking the blood glucose levels in quite the same way. Really big difference. So when people say carbs are bad, we need to be understanding what form are we talking about? Because sure, most people know pure sugar is not going to do them any good, but actually some potato in your dinner at night can make a really big difference to just how you feel, how you sleep, and your energy levels the next day. Also, how kind of restricted you feel. If you are constantly feeling like you're restricting foods and not able to eat certain things, you may not stick to that whole kind of dietary structure so long. So we can bring in some of these carbohydrates. It gives you more variety, you feel less restricted, and you're more likely to be able to keep doing it. The second part with the carbohydrate discussion is carbohydrate timing. And this comes down to when you eat the carbohydrates and you get this blood sugar rise, what are you doing around that time that's going to use that? Your muscle mass is your best glucose sink, the best way to get glucose out of your bloodstream and into energy pathways where it's utilized well is into your muscle mass. This means that if you're eating a whole lot of carbohydrates first thing in the morning, when you're going into the office to sit down for the day and you're not really going to be moving around so much, you're not really getting the best benefit out of them. What you might be getting instead is a blood sugar rise, insulin goes up, your blood sugar drops, you get a crash, and then you go and hit the lolly jar in the office, for example. So you can create this little bit of maybe a hunger roller coaster or a cravings roller coaster. So what we really recommend with our clients and what we see work really, really well, and actually if you test this out long enough, you'll feel it in yourself and you'll understand why we do it, is really leaning the first couple of meals of the day more towards proteins, fibers, and fats, and actually keep the carbohydrates, even the whole food carbohydrates, on the lower side. And what this does is it avoids any of these kind of spikes, which can be related to that blood sugar going up from the carbohydrate, especially at a time of the day when you may be more, well, you have higher cortisol first thing in the morning anyway. You may be a little bit more stressed if you've got stresses at work. That also drives cortisol up, and cortisol raises blood sugar on its own. It allows you to be able to keep your blood sugars a little bit more stable. You can manage your hunger and appetite a little bit more. Your energy stays a lot more stable throughout the day. And most importantly, your mental clarity stays really, really stable. This means you can be more effective at the work that you're doing, and you can save those carbohydrates for later in the day when you're looking to bring something in to satiate you and help your nervous system wind down. So when it comes to carbohydrate timing, we're really big on looking towards moving them to the later part of the day and really leaning on your fats for a fuel source earlier in the day, because it just gives that nice consistent energy and mental clarity, which is really important. Keeps you off the sugar roller coaster as well, which keeps the cravings at bay. The third part to the carbohydrate discussion is the dosing piece, and this is very much determined by your personal need. What works for one will not work for another. A 100-kilo, well-muscled young male individual who's working out often and really, really active is going to tolerate a lot more carbohydrates in their diet than someone who is, say, 70 kilos but has a lot of weight to lose and is relatively sedentary and maybe already has high blood sugar levels. So what determines the dose is actually you as the individual, and this is where we dive into blood work and we look at this from an individual perspective, and then we really kind of make our carbohydrate dosing recommendations, even our timing recommendations, around the individual's blood work. If you want to know more about this, we have a whole blood work offer that we could look at for you. We can link that below. But the key here when it comes to dosing is, first there's the dose across the day. Now we don't kind of lean really heavily towards the keto style approach unless we need to. We're more in the moderate, or I would say the moderate lower carbohydrate space, where we're not pushing carbohydrates excessively. We're really using both fuel systems, fats and carbs, but it's more in that moderate space. So we're looking at around about 75 to maybe up to 120 grams of carbohydrates per day. That's not of the food, but actually of the carbohydrates that's in the food. This means that across your meals, you don't need to be too restrictive. You can have all of the different vegetables in there. You can have some berries. You could have some citrus fruit and whatnot. It's not going to feel super restrictive like perhaps a keto plan does, but it's also not going to be just front loading all your meals with bread or grains either. So 75-ish to 120 grams across the course of a day. And ideally, I don't like to see too much more than 30 grams in a meal in any one go. And the reason for this is that if you eat that food and that glucose is going into your bloodstream, you need to be being pretty active in the sort of hour or so following your meal in order to use more than 30 grams of carbohydrates efficiently. That means that as that goes into your bloodstream, if you're not using it, it is going to get diverted, go through the liver and turn into a triglyceride or into a fat. Now that's not a problem, but if that is happening on repeat, we are going to see an accumulation of weight gain over time, or maybe a disruption to those blood sugar markers over time as well. So the dosing really is that total volume across the day, but then how you split that. It might be that I don't really like to see people going full keto all day and then just binging on their carbs at night. You know, if we spread it out a little bit and we're getting some carbohydrates from those vegetables in your salad at lunch or whatever it is you're having at lunch, maybe from some of your berries at breakfast time in a smoothie or something like that, you're spreading those out across the day. They're coming from the whole food forms. They're not coming in big doses at any given time. They might be slightly more heavily weighted towards your dinner time meal intentionally because we're putting some potato or some sweet potato in there. And the points to that is that we often see this play out for women women in particular, but it does occur for men too, who have been maybe fasting or doing a really lower carbohydrate or keto plan. And when we put some carbohydrates into that dinner time meal, we often see their sleep quality improve. And that's because carbohydrates are a little bit of a signal to the body to wind down, to calm down that nervous system, and that can really improve sleep quality as well. And the next day, often you have this better energy capacity because you've restocked those glycogen stores and you actually just feel quite good and satiated. So there's the carbohydrate form piece, really looking at the form of the carbohydrates you're eating. Most of your carbohydrates should be coming from whole foods like berries, your vegetables, root vegetables at night, maybe some basmati rice or some quinoa or something like that. And then your timing of that, leaning more towards the end of the day, not binging at the end of the day and restricting early on, but just leaning it more towards the end of the day for that nice wind down effect and to avoid that sort of sugar roller coaster that can occur. And then dosing, and that's going to be very much determined by your blood work, but as a general rule, we're sort of leaning towards that 75 to 120 grams of carbohydrates per day. And it really is about the fact that it's the nice sweet spot where you can actually have a good vegetable variety, not feel too restricted, but also not be kind of pushing that carbohydrate limit if you're not metabolically able to deal with that sugar. So that's my carbohydrate piece. It is kind of complicated. It is just a piece of the puzzle, but it's really important to understand, and I think just do away with the idea that they are good or bad. They're just a fuel source, and we get the best benefit from them when we know how to use them and how to apply them to ourselves specifically. If you'd like more help in understanding this, we can obviously do this by looking at your blood work, but hopefully this gives you something to take away and just examine your food with and see what you're doing on a daily basis. I'll see you next time. Bye.